Welcome to Narrative Responsibility, a podcast about examining the meta story of your life, how well it is serving you, and how to change it for the better. I'm Elena Wolf, relationship coach and life alignment mentor, and this is this week's New Perspective.
Hi there! I'm so glad you're here today. This is episode 30, Feature versus Bug, Calculating Relational Needs with MBTI. Up front, I know the sound quality is different. I am so sorry. I moved out of my work studio, which had this beautiful closet that I got to use to record in, and I have not found a suitable space or a suitable way to make one. And I'm driving myself crazy. It's why I didn't have an episode last week, and I'm at my wit's end. Like, I almost rage quit podcasting today. I was so, I couldn't handle it anymore. So I decided to just get on my headset that I use for client calls. It's good enough for Buttkeep Radio. It's good enough for this for a week, maybe two, maybe a month. I don't know. For now, this is where we are. I'm so sorry, but it was that or not do this. So anyway, the topic today is one that was requested by one of my Patreon members. Actually, she requested it before I gave my talk at BAPT, so even though it sort of seems like a flow-on from that conference presentation and then the adaptation of it that I did with episode 29, it's actually a conversation that predates that presentation. Specifically, we were talking about how different relationships can basically help us meet different needs in terms of our functions. Like, we might have certain friends that are really good for meeting our sensing needs and other friends that are better at meeting our intuiting needs. And she really wanted to know more about that topic and asked if I could unpack it on an episode. I said, sure. I will also warn you all up front, this is going to be long. My original take on it was 50 minutes before I edited, and I don't think I'm going to be any less long-winded today. We'll see. But yeah, this topic is near and dear to my heart as a relationship coach. I actually feel like using your type preferences and understanding your partner's type preferences or anyone else that you're in a relationship with. Like, this actually is much bigger than just romantic partnerships. It is hugely helpful in your relationship with your kids. It can help with relationships with family members, with coworkers, with friends, all sorts of things. So it's all your relationships in general benefit from you knowing your type and the type of the person that you're interacting with, because we do have specific psychological needs that can be correlated to our cognitive functions. Yes, we have all 8 of the cognitive functions, and we're all going to have some degree of need in most of, the common psychological relational needs. But we might have different degrees of one need or another, and we might also have different capacities to meet that need in someone else. So just understanding type and this sort of relational needs that tend to come with each function can be a huge leverage point for recognizing when you are or are not the right person to try and meet a need for someone in your life, or for being able to figure out who in your life is going to be the best person to go to for this need that you might have. And before we get any deeper into type stuff, I do want to mention my general philosophy on relationships and relational needs, which is that we all need a village. We have the saying that it takes a village to raise a child, but really we all need a village throughout our lifetime, because we have too many needs for any one person to be responsible for meeting them all, and also just too many facets for any one relationship to be able to really embrace and interface with all of those different aspects of ourselves. So we need to have a variety of relationships where our various parts are celebrated and our various needs are met. One thing I think that modern American culture really does is privilege and prioritize our pairmate relationships and then put way too much pressure on them. So I'm a big advocate of having a lot of intimate relationships in your life. And no, intimacy does not necessarily correlate with sexual intimacy. That is a type of intimacy. But we have needs for emotional intimacy, psychological intimacy, intellectual intimacy, spiritual intimacy, physical intimacy that is separate from sexual intimacy, experiential intimacy, and honestly there's probably others. That was just the list that I came up with when I sat down and thought about this. So we need to have friendships, we need to have mentorships or menteeships with other people, we need to have relationships with our family, our extended family, or if your blood family is either thin on the ground or unsupportive, then what we would call family of the heart. But we need to have access to different types of intimacy and different types of relationships that allow us to experience those different types of intimacy. And part of the reason that we really need this is in order to stay balanced. If we get unbalanced in terms of our needs, then we can easily fall prey to basically the subconscious drive to get that need met, possibly at the expense of other goals or other priorities in our life, possibly at the expense of our well being if the pathway to meeting that need that our subconscious chooses is something that's fundamentally unhealthy. And part of being a sovereign adult who's exercising agency of your own life, basically having a deliberate direction for the story of your life, is recognizing that ignoring needs is just going to cause them to erupt elsewhere. So it's part of your responsibility as a sovereign adult to make sure that you're addressing your needs. Why? Because needs are not wants. We don't choose them. Like, we don't choose to have needs in the first place, and we also don't get to choose what our needs are. That's why they're called needs. The only thing we can choose is how we meet them, or whether we try to meet them as opposed to try to ignore them and hope they go away. Spoiler alert, they don't. So, you have to try to meet them. Now, as kind of the bridge to talking about the specifics of needs against our psychological type, I want to say that fundamentally, most people have the same core need for their relationships, and that is to be seen, accepted, and celebrated for being who you are. Physiologically, biologically, psychologically, humans are social animals. We need to feel a sense of belonging. We need to feel that we are welcome in our relationships, in our community with other people. We need to see ourselves mirrored and affirmed by the people around us. Now, this doesn't have to mean finding other people who are like us. That's one easy way to do it. And why is it easy? Because it doesn't take a lot of extra effort or energy on either side of the equation. If you find somebody who's very similar to yourself, you can just groove and you both enjoy it and have fun and feel very affirmed and accepted and delighted in. But you can also feel affirmed and mirrored when you see other people actively making space for you to show up as you are and not have to conform to some other way of being that is more preferable or more comfortable to them. When somebody actively makes us feel safe and welcome and wanted and valued for being who we are. Or when someone is actively trying to relate to us in a way that we prefer that maybe they don't. All of those can also make us feel really mirrored and welcome and accepted and affirmed. It's just that they have an energetic cost to them. They require empathy from the people around us, and they require those people to choose to spend some of their energy maybe going outside of their preferred way of relating to meet us where we are, or going, making a point to spend energy affirming, hey, you're welcome, you're wanted, come on in. And the flip side of that is that we have to be willing to be vulnerable with other people. We have to be willing to admit to being who we really are, and to asking other people to understand us. We might have to be willing to explain a little bit if we have a way of being that's not necessarily obvious to them or familiar to them. The core need there is not really changing. It's connection and reciprocal empathy with others as we stand in our authenticity and they stand in their authenticity. But that core need can have a lot of different forms. And the different forms, or what you might think of as different pathways to meeting that core need, very often do reflect our psychological type preferences. I'm going to offer a few statistics here because I think this is actually a really key point to understanding why type has so much power in framing our psychological needs. Because not all personality types are distributed equally in the population. One of the really big splits is between intuiting and sensing. Something like 70 to 80% of the population has a preference for sensing rather than intuiting. And so in a lot of ways, the world is sort of set up by and for people with a sensing preference. What we consider normative to our culture is often based in having a sensing preference. And sometimes that means that those with an intuiting preference are sort of at odds with their culture. They're maybe viewed as oddballs or a little bit strange or impractical or ungrounded or flighty, all sorts of things that maybe seem a little bit unhelpful, shall we say. And intuitives, for their part, are often struggling with this need to see themselves mirrored and positively affirmed. They want to be able to talk about, abstract, idealistic, perspective shifting, and speculative future casting kind of conversations. And if they don't have people to do that with, they get really lonely and feel kind of lost and like there's something wrong with them. I talked more about that in my episode, The Ugly Duckling, about growing up as a high intuitive preference person in a sensing family. And if you start looking at gender skews, it can get even worse. For example, with women, which is the gender proportions I'm a little more familiar with, there is something like, I think 35 to 40% of women have sensor, feeler, judger preferences. In contrast, less than 2% have either of the intuiting, thinking, judging preference types. In terms of hard numbers, it's something like 1 in 125 women will statistically have INTJ preferences, and 1 in 125 will have ENTJ preferences. So take 125 women. Statistically, you've got one of each. So in that whole group of 125, you have 2 people who can mirror each other. And then you compare that to the SFJs, who are, 35 to 40% of the population. In that group of 125, they've got like 40 to 50 people. It's almost impossible that they have never had the experience of seeing themselves mirrored in someone else's cognitive profile, in someone else's functions, in someone else's kind of default way of seeing the world. Whereas for that little INTJ and that little ENTJ, did they find each other in that group of 125? Did they know each other? Or was that, group split into 2 different villages and they spent their whole life never seeing somebody else who was like them? Or at least not another person of their same gender who was like them. So, one of the ways that type affects our relational needs is kind of this very basic desire to see our way of looking at the world modeled to us, to see someone else do our functions in with the same kind of relative capacity that we have to do our functions. And there's a lot of deeper implications for how you tend to see the world that come with your type preferences. Just the sort of perceptual biases you have, the way you work with information and input, the kind of things that you feel are important or relevant or interesting. Often that has a strong correlation to your cognitive preferences. And so if you don't have other people like you that you're seeing in your culture, in your family, in your village around you, then you start to wonder, what's wrong with me? Why is there nobody else like me? And you start to mask, you start to pretend to be someone you're not. You start to adapt and adopt all of these behaviors that aren't really you. You'll talk about liking things that you don't really like because you're trying to fit in, because you're trying to meet this core need of being accepted. But remember what I said initially, that the goal is to have yourself accepted as you stand in your authenticity by someone else who is standing in their authenticity. So if you are masking any part of who you are, if you are pretending to be someone you're not, to prefer to behave in ways that you don't actually prefer, to like things that you don't actually like, then you're not in your authenticity and you cannot actually get that need satisfied. You'll know on some level that you don't really belong, or at least that you don't really feel the sense of belonging that you're trying to get because you're not able to be authentic and still see yourself accepted. So, moving out of the high level and kind of coming down a little bit to more specifics, how can type show up as an influence on our relational needs in the specific form that they take? Or another way to think about this might be, how does type affect how we want to be shown that we are welcome and wanted just the way we are? That we are safe to lean into our natural way of being because we can trust that it's going to be honored. Well, in the Myers-Briggs system, there are 16 personality types, and the dynamic of relating between each of the 16 types with each of the other types would be a huge project. I mean, it's basically a podcast episode per pairing. So we're going to have to stick somewhat higher level than that. It's also worth remembering that type doesn't happen in a vacuum. Your personality type preferences might have been unevenly welcome. Like part of how you presented was welcome and part of how you presented was not. And so that's going to affect the type of relational need that you have with that function. The one that was welcomed, you just have maintenance needs. You just need to be able to express that with other people. The one that was rejected has also a deeper healing need. You really have to rehabilitate your sense that this function can be welcome with other people. But in order to keep this moving without getting bogged down again in like 100 little caveats, I'm going to just say most of the time, if you want to serve the people that you're in relationship with, you need to be looking at your top two functions and their top two functions. So let's look at those 8 cognitive functions and what they might be needing in relationships, or how they might need people in their life to show up. Or if you're using one of these functions, then these might be ways that you have unmet needs and could either seek out relationships to meet them or ask for this from people in your life. I'm going to go through the judging functions first and then the perceiving functions. Extroverted feeling really needs to be taken care of. This is a very common lack of reciprocity that I see in a lot of extroverted feeling clients and friends. They spend so much time and energy taking care of other people, and they're really hoping that someone will also take care of them in that same kind of way, put the same sort of care and thoughtfulness and energy toward taking care of them. And it can feel really lonely and disheartening if they're not getting it. So to all my extroverted feeling people out there, like, I see you. I see how hard you work to take care of the people around you, and I really hope that they are giving you that back. The other thing that extroverted feeling often seems to look for is having people who will create shared emotional or energetic space with them. And this is sort of like you're throwing a party and you want everybody to kind of be in the right mood for it and bring the right energy to it so that you're all kind of vibing together and enhancing it instead of, kind of having these pockets of weird energy and dissonant emotion that kind of keep the room and the party from gelling and being cohesive. So those are often things that extroverted feeling is looking for in its relationships. Extroverted thinking really needs to feel like it can rely on you. If it delegates something, it really needs to be able to trust that that's just taken care of according to the standards that extroverted thinking has set, at least meeting the minimum necessary metrics for success. And the other thing that extroverted thinking is often looking for is people to build with, like people to collaborate with toward a shared goal or a kind of common project. And this tends to be more tangible than emotional, but this is really a way that extroverted thinking feels connected to others and affirmed by others. Is like, hey, you bought into this project with just as much enthusiasm and energy as I did, and now look at us. We built something super cool that is kind of above and beyond what just my part or just your part would have created. Introverted feeling. So we're moving into the introverted judging functions now. Introverted feeling really needs to be heard. It needs to be able to express its experience and emotions and intentions, maybe even dreams and ideals, and to have a supportive response. It doesn't necessarily need somebody to agree with it, just someone to hear with compassion what perspective introverted feeling is bringing. And I think introverted feeling is also often really looking for someone to share aesthetic or peak experiences, or maybe you might think of them as numinous moments with, because introverted feeling is often deeply, profoundly affected by that kind of experience. And it really wants to have someone else who feels with as much depth and nuance as it does. And so I think that's one of the ways that introverted feeling is often kind of left looking for more in its relationships, is if it doesn't have other people who are experiencing and expressing the same depth and intensity of emotional experience. Introverted thinking needs to be able to drill down to the truth without having to worry about feelings or someone taking offense. It needs to be able to speak truth and just parse out all of the data, all of the information until it feels that it has arrived at accurate information. I'm wanting to say like maybe the truth, but that's not really what it's about. It's just maybe more like verified information. And the process of getting there and getting really clear on what all of the points are and what all of the different aspects of a context are can, for some people, be boring and for other people be upsetting. It feels challenging, or it feels like you're just trying to debate me. And introverted thinking can, sometimes have that mode, but it's really what it's trying to do internally is to arrive at this sense of I can trust all of the data that I have, and I know now what all the data in the system is, therefore I can construct my conclusions and trust them. And so is really looking for people who can do that and go all the way to the end of that line without getting offended and without basically withdrawing from the relationship or the interaction. And I think introverted thinking is also often looking for people who are willing to extend their principles and uphold them across contexts rather than looking at an outcome and then saying, oh, that's an unacceptable outcome. I'm not going to actually stand by this principle at all. I'm not an introverted thinking user, but I believe this is kind of a sore point with a lot of them where they'll see people who claim to have a certain value or to act on a certain principle and then abandon it because they don't like how it's going to play out in action. So then it is just sort of like, well, how can I trust you and how can I believe in you if you only adhere to these principles when it's convenient or when you like where it goes? So that's, I think, an unmet relational need for a lot of TI users is to have people that they can trust to actually follow the principles that they espouse. So those are our 4 judging functions and the types of interactions they tend to look for and maybe what they might be missing in their relationships. So let's look at our perceiving functions. So extroverted sensing is often looking to experience the now moment with other people. Like it wants to have experiences, maybe new experiences, or maybe just kind of rich experiences in the moment. You know, someone to share the sunset with, someone to share this meal with. And that's one of the ways that it connects is to have shared experiences right here, right now with another person. Extroverted sensing also really needs freedom to move and adapt and be able to meet life as it comes. Like extroverted sensing is that foot on the road function, if you want to think of it that way. And, you know, they really want to have people who allow them freedom and who aren't going to punish them or shame them if they need to change plans or if they have to have some degree of flexibility and ability to move within a plan or something like that. Which, you know, to certain other types, if we want to think about our growth alignments chart, to certain other types that can feel chaotic. It can feel like I'm not able to build anything because you're over there blowing with the wind, right? But for people who have strong extroverted sensing, they need to feel safe to be free, at least in certain ways within their relationships. And I think that can be hard for them to find if they're surrounded by a lot of types that are, say, on that controlling edge rather than the emerging chaotic edge of the growth alignments. What about introverted sensing? Introverted sensing, I think, is often looking for people to experience time with as like a through line. Like they really want to have experiences with people over a long time. They want that sense of reliability and dependability, stability with another person where like, hey, we've done this together and this and this and this. I have this string of memories and you're in all of them. And that feels like intimacy. That feels like our relationship is solid. And I think they're also looking for people that they can rely on to participate in traditions because often the introverted sensing preference really gets a lot of comfort and joy out of repeating experiences and saying, hey, this was such a warm, lovely experience the first time. I want to go back to that place. And then the second time, it's sort of like a double layer because, oh, I have the comfort of redoing something that brought me a lot of joy to begin with. And now, you know, it's still comforting and bringing me joy in the moment too. So, you know, it kind of has that dual layer and traditions and repetitions can build and get stronger over time for this type preference. And it can be really hurtful when other people don't see that or value that or want to participate. And, you know, on the flip side, yes, some of the insistence on, oh, we have to have the same meal the same time can feel stifling or like not very pleasant to other types. But, you know, I think when you can understand that your introverted sensing person is looking for that tradition and that repetition because it layers meaning and comfort and joy onto the experience, then maybe you can be a little more willing to buy into it with them, or find the aspects of their traditions that do make you happy that you can do with them. So what about the intuiting functions? Introverted intuiting really needs to have their vision trusted or believed in. And this one, I think, is a lot harder for other types to necessarily buy into, especially if the introverted intuiting preference person is very young, because, most people don't just trust automatically. You kind of have to see how things play out a few times in order to feel like, oh, this instrument is reliable or this prediction is reliable. And that includes somebody using this predictive function or this I am picking up energy from the ether and interpreting it in this way kind of function. And, over time, when you see them be right over and over and over again, when you can recognize, oh, they really are picking up on subtleties and these hidden connections between things that are maybe not obvious on the surface, but are there, then you can trust what they have to say. You can kind of buy into their vision with them. But I think that's one of the ways that introverted intuiting people can often feel really kind of shut out and lonely, is if they're treated maybe like a dreamer or a naive child, when in fact their cognitive function is based on subtle pattern recognition and subtle input and very powerful future casting, like arc of inevitability casting power. The other way I think that introverted intuiting is really looking for connection with, or to be related to, is to have a shared language of symbolism. And I don't mean symbolism that's necessarily going to be culturally explicable, but rather something that's specific to them and another person, whether this is another person buying into their own personal, like the introverted intuiting person's own personal cosmology of symbols, or if it's something that they've created together. But as an example, say you met your partner and she was wearing a yellow dress and you said something like, oh, you look like a ray of sunshine, or you look like a buttercup, or something like that. And then you started bringing her a yellow flower as you take her on dates. And what does that yellow flower mean? Is it just like, oh, well, it's tradition, I bring you a yellow flower? Or is it, oh, I'm just trying to call back to the day we met and, you had that yellow dress on? Or is it like, I am referencing this symbol that we created in that moment, this beautiful flower, this ray of sunshine. I'm saying you're still my sunshine, and I'm bringing you this flower to remind you of that. When the symbol is there, when that shared symbol is there, it means something different. And I think that is also something that for an introverted intuiting type preference person is extremely intimate and extremely rare to find someone that will go in on that with you. What about extroverted intuiting? Extroverted intuiting, I think, is looking for people to explore ideas with and possibilities with. They want to dream and brainstorm and just have absolutely no holds barred. Doesn't matter if it's practical, doesn't matter if it's really relevant to the topic or not. If it popped into their brain, they want to be able to say it and throw it, onto the table with everything else that has come up in this conversation, in the brainstorm session, and feel like that's welcome. I feel like a lot of times extroverted intuiting people get sort of punished for not curating their ideas, but that's not really how that function works. And so, as a way to kind of make them feel safe in relating, just let it be okay that they that they bring 10 ideas and 3 of them are absolutely outlandish and possibly not relevant. You know what? They're welcome anyway. Bring them in. The other thing I think that extroverted intuiting really looks for is having the freedom to consider different options, like different future pathways, and maybe even to try to build novel outcomes out of what's going on right now. Maybe try to remix the current situation into something new and something different. I think this can feel threatening to a lot of personality types because they are either leaning into the sameness, or they feel like, oh, this is going to disrupt what I have been building. This is going to disrupt my plan. Again, the emerging edge kind of in conflict with the controlling side. But that's also part of what extroverted intuiting needs. It needs to have some room to maneuver and to build from what is, to explore or at least consider different pathways that could come into being, that are coming into being, emerging, from the present moment, rather than always having everything mapped out and predictable and pre-decided. So yeah, that's the 8 functions and what they are often looking for in their relationships, and maybe it's kind of a what they're looking for and not commonly getting. um, So, as you listen to these different functions and what they might be looking for in relationships, I hope you can pick up on the fact that there is kind of a real, is this a feature or a bug aspect to this? Because, you might have heard some of them and thought, God, that sounds like a nightmare. I don't want to be in a relationship where somebody's looking for that from me. And then there might have been some where you're like, oh my God, yes, give me more of that. That's exactly what I'm after. And the ones that you responded to may or may not have been your own preferences in terms of what you have capacity for or what you are interested in. As an example, I particularly love conversations with extroverted, intuiting, dominant people. I have, I guess, a high tolerance for the chaos and the randomness, um, and I find it very exciting and very magical. But I know that that's not necessarily true for all introverted, intuiting dominants. It's just sort of, I think, partly how your function plays with that other function, partly how other aspects of your psyche might play with that kind of energy, and maybe also what your experiences have been. Have you had close relationships with people who used functions in certain ways and kind of showed you how to play with them or how to play well with them? Have you maybe found access points to that function inside yourself come through other people? And so maybe you like that function and the energy of it, but you can't find it on your own. And you're like, oh, but when somebody who does use that gets me going, that's when I can find it. And I do enjoy experiencing that side of myself while I'm with this other person. So, yeah, it might be that for one person in your life, it's a bug. Like, that's a flaw. They get annoyed by that aspect of you. But for somebody else, that is exactly why they like hanging out with you. And that's kind of the whole point of having a village. Like, that's the beauty of it, is that you can spend time with different people who experience you differently and bring out different sides of you and meet different parts of you where you are. And, you can have different people in your life where your capacity is really strong. And it's like, hey, I can spend all day with you, meeting your needs and giving you something nobody else in your life gives you. And that feels amazing to me. And because I have a high capacity with that particular relational need, it's easy for me to do that for you. Like, that's good synergy. And then you might have other people where that's not the case, and you sort of have to curate the time that you spend with them. Like, how can I give them what they need from me most, but in a way that isn't so distressing to me, that actually honors my needs and my capacities a little better. So these are just some things to think about as you kind of move forward from having listened to this and digested this episode. But yeah, in general, taking care of the people that we're in relationships with tends to mean tuning into their top two function needs and making sure that we're meeting them at least some of the time. Part of having harmonious relationships is also taking the time to check in with ourselves and see what is our capacity to meet that need at this time. And, looking at our needs and kind of gauging where someone else's capacity might be to meet them, or asking, I'm feeling like I need this right now. Can you meet that for me? Type gives us a really great language for these needs, and I think it really depersonalizes why we have them. If you're understanding that, oh, well, this is my cognitive profile, and my psyche is literally designed to spend most of my time in this function and that function, and these are the ways those two functions seek to connect and feel intimacy with other people, like, you're not choosing the ways that you need to be related to. You're not trying to be difficult. You're not trying to be needy or demanding or anything like that. It's just that's literally how you were built. And neither is someone else trying to be difficult or trying to be needy when they have different needs from you. All it means is that they have a different set of cognitive preferences. They have a different mix of capacity and a different mix of need with those 8 functions than what you have, with how those 8 functions show up for you. And I don't know, maybe some of this sounds a little bit cold and calculating to think like, oh, I'm going to try to meet somebody's top function need and auxiliary function need. But honestly, the reality of life and the reality of relationships is that we all have finite time and finite energy. It actually makes sense to spend our time wisely and deliberately meeting the needs that are both easiest for us to meet and that will have the biggest impact on the person that we're in this relationship with, and that would be appropriate for that person to be asking us to meet for them. You might have times where you're really needing, say, a particular kind of conversation or a particular kind of care, and the friend that you are having coffee with is not actually the friend who can give you that. Just recognizing, oh, I need to not ask them for this right now. I need to know that, oh, I'm going to call my mom or I'm going to call my best friend at the end of the day and get this need met, then can allow you to be more present to that friend and give them grace to meet the need that they naturally meet for you. Maybe they're not the friend you go to for extroverted feeling caretaking, but they are the friend you go to for intuitive conversation. Great. Get that intuitive conversation need met, and then get your extroverted feeling need met with someone that's good at that. So, yeah. Basically, you need a village, and when you can understand how your various relational needs fit with the capacities and needs of the people in your village, then it becomes a lot easier to kind of streamline getting them met with people that it's easy for that person to meet that need because they have a high capacity with it. I hope that this has been kind of a coherent presentation. Again, it's just a huge topic, and trying to fit this into even an extra thick episode doesn't really allow a lot of nuance and deep diving on it. So if you do have specific questions, please let me know. You can drop a comment on one of my public posts on my Patreon page. You can join my Patreon and join the discussion there. So, yeah. That's it for this week. I appreciate you sticking with me through the pauses that I've had this last couple months. Spring has been busier than I expected and has had some plot twists. I'll try to put up some visual aids or summaries on my Patreon. I know in advance that's going to get requested, so I'm acknowledging it. I'm going to try and do that by the end of the week. And if you want to know more about my work as a coach, maybe you liked this whole concept and want to have a conversation with me specifically about your relationships, you can check out thepatternbreaker.com. You can follow my dilettante Instagram at thepatternbreaker. You can check out my Patreon, patreon.com/narrative responsibility. And until next time, what part of your story are you going to take responsibility for this week?